Good afternoon again, everyone. For those of you who've joined us over the past few months, then welcome back. If you're new to all of this, then welcome. Bonjour et bienvenue si vous avez nous joindre pour nos autres webinaires. Merci si c'est votre première fois. Très bien, on espère que vous trouvez la valeur aujourd'hui. I'm Mark Healy. I'm the Executive Director of the Ivey Academy. That's the Learning and Development wing of Ivey Business School here in London. Je suis le chef d'éducation exécutif à l'école de commerce Ivey. C'est à l'Université Western en Ontario. It's almost the holiday season, and that means it's almost time to watch my favorite holiday movie. That's Scrooged. Some of you will know that if you're of the right demographic. That's a Bill Murray movie. It's over 25 years old. You know, there's some funny references in it. One of the references that always catches me is to Acid Rain, and I don't know if you remember when that was a thing, but I remember that was a thing. And it struck me during this COVID period, especially in the last couple of months. I've been wondering where all the corporate culture went. It seems here in this pandemic world, we've talked a lot about productivity, organizational well-being. We've talked about trends and realities, but I thought it was a bit strange that culture was taking a bit of a backseat. It wasn't sort of top of mind or top of the conversation. And then in the last couple of weeks, it sort of reemerged. Yesterday I spent the day with a client running a strat planning process. It's a large manufacturer. They have a mix of line jobs and office and executive jobs. And they formally decided to put a strategic objective into 2021 against measuring the impact of COVID, the impact of remote work, and changing ways of doing business on their corporate culture, which they really treasure, as a lot of companies do. I thought that was quite profound. It means, formally spending time, energy, and money, quite a bit of money, and accountability in terms of reporting back to their board on that initiative and on culture. And so, today, that's what we're going to talk about: shifting cultures. We often define organizational culture as the collective norms or behaviors exhibited by employees. Culture is guided by purpose and values. Typically, can be thought of as an organization's internal compass or rudder. And I think we all know a healthy corporate culture is essential to attract and deliver value. In some organizations, they consider it a competitive advantage, and all of that is kind of being challenged these days. And so I want to just take a minute to introduce our guests today. We're really lucky, as always, to be joined by some fantastic guests. Today we have with us Val Duffy. Val's former CHRO of the GTA, that's the Toronto Airport Authority. With Mark Edgar with us. He's former CHRO RSA and founder of Goat Rodeo Project. And we also have Linda Speedy with us. Linda's VP Human Resources at JD Irving Limited in the Maritimes. So Val and Mark are going to share a new framework that they've developed called Reimagining Work. It's got 5 key paradigm shifts that are impacting culture and the HR function. And then we'll shift gears. We'll talk to Linda about JD Irving, sort of in a different space, privately owned Canadian conglomerate, 17,000 employees. We'll talk a bit about what's shaping culture and what the response to the pandemic has looked like there. We'll bring everyone together for the last half and have a bit of a panel, take some audience questions. Okay, so Sean, as always, we have our executive producer, that's Sean Ackland-Grant, with us. Can we just go to you for a minute or two on the flow and how things are going to work today, please?
Sure. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Feel free to submit your questions, any and as many questions as you can think of. You can do that by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of your window. You can also upvote other questions in that panel, anything else you'd like to see answered, and we'll watch for the top submissions. You can also participate in the chat window. Set your responses to all panelists and attendees so that other participants can reply and discuss ideas. Within the next day, we'll also send out a link to the recording as well as any slides or other resources referenced during the session. Thanks. Back to you.
Okay, thanks a lot. So Mark and Val, you folks are up first. I want to get into this new frame that you've developed. No question that COVID has propelled a pretty big shift in how and where we work, at least in some places. Ushered in some pretty big changes in some workplaces, and just want to think a little bit about how you're looking at the future and the future of the workplace. So over to you to kick things off.
Whoops, got to unmute myself there. Going to put up our slides. And thank you very much for the warm welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Real pleasure to be with the Ivey community once again for a live stream event. I'm going to kick us off with a brief introduction and then pass you along to my collaborator, Mark Edgar. We call our body of work Reimagine Work because we believe that this is the moment in time for us to, all of us, to think big, to think creatively, and to think very purposefully about work and its place in our lives, in our communities, and in our society as a whole. Whoops, trying to get on to the next slide. Here we are. And here we are. This is us. So as Mark Healy mentioned off the top, Mark and I are both experienced chief HR officers. I'm in search of my next role. Mark is fully engaged in his consulting practice. And we've been collaborating for some months now on this body of work. And it started off quite organically with us just wanting to kind of be helpful to our fellow CHROs who didn't have the kind of bandwidth that we did because we were on the outside and they were in the trenches. So as we started to absorb all of this kind of fast moving trends and we really wanted to be able to kind of dialogue with our friends about all the things that we were seeing. And now, kind of many months and many roundtable meetings later, we find that we have CEOs and CHROs who are inviting us in on a consulting basis to help them reset and realign their people strategies against these new paradigms. Because again, the immediacy of the work, given that we are in many parts of the country in this big second wave, CHROs are still in the trenches, and yet, making sure that there is a future-focused HR strategy is also paramount. In terms of the approach that we took, in the early days, and I know that you'll all remember this, and to a certain extent it's still true, but the market was absolutely buzzing in those early days with all manner of conference calls and webinars. The big consulting houses were issuing white papers. There was a plethora of kind of open source information and open forum dialogues about how organizations were facing into the pandemic. And of course, it was all about people. Keeping them safe, taking care not just of employees, but of their families, communicating and leading differently, getting people equipped to work remotely. The employee stakeholder jumped into the center of most every organization, and the HR leader in turn quickly became the essential player at the executive table. And so we were witnessing real time how this shared societal experience of the pandemic, and then later on the calls for social reform in the wake of the George Floyd death, that was creating a fundamental reset in terms of the world of work. And much of what we saw unfolding had already been contemplated. So the future of work was already, kind of on the drawing board and very much underway. And many of those elements were becoming accelerated, and some of the thought leaders would say by as many as 10 years. And then, of course, there were other elements that were quite germane to the pandemic, like the health and safety measures. So our approach, as we started getting our arms around this, was to kind of diverge and identify all of those real-time insights and trends, and then converge on this emerging picture of work reimagined and the framework that we're going to share with you shortly. We believe that it's the organizations that adapt quickly and consciously and embrace this reset that are going to be the ones to win and thrive in the new world of work. So in principle, we set out to create a very big picture, kind of agnostic view, agnostic in terms of industry or region, with some practical kind of usable insights. We took a test and iterate approach. So what you'll see today is certainly not what we had on the drawing board months ago. It definitely has evolved. But the one piece I think that is important to acknowledge from the outset, especially because we are going to be talking to Linda in terms of the experience at JDI, is that this is very biased toward knowledge workers and office environments. So that's really important to kind of get out there from the outset. I'm going to pass it along to Mark.
Thanks, Val. Appreciate that. Great to be here, everybody, and hope everybody is well. So let me just kind of build on a couple of the points that Val made there. So the dimensions that we identified through our framework, you'll see here on the slide. I'm sure you'll recognize many of these words. Mark's referred to a few of them already in his introduction. This is a framework when it comes to organization dimensions that Val and I have used in our corporate CHRO roles. Why we think it's important is really just, it's a way of providing a very holistic view of what's going on within an organization. What we find is that from a lot of the thought leadership that we were referring to when everybody was in lockdown was certainly taking more of a one-dimensional approach. And so we thought it was really important to try and create something that was a bit more holistic, something that could provide a bit of a roadmap and a blueprint around what the opportunities were for an organization to really think about how they could reimagine work. So the dimensions that you see here really were a way of thinking about that. Values, I really like the way that Mark just described that, the rudder for an organization, culture, leadership, organizational capabilities, and then the talent strategy. And the talent strategy is a bit of a catch-all for all of the things that CHROs think about in terms of really thinking about what do you do with your talent to ensure that they can really be effective within the organization. So if we just move to the next slide, what you'll see here is really what we were thinking in terms of shifting from a traditional paradigm to more of an emerging paradigm. So the traditional paradigm you'll recognize, and you may be fair to say that we've maybe exaggerated a little bit here to kind of make a point, but there are many organizations who certainly will continue to have a very profit-centric approach and really think about shareholder value as being their main area of focus. And what we've experienced, and Val has mentioned this already, is a significant shift across a number of different dimensions. So we're already seeing a significant number of global shifts happening within organizations. This would include things like technology acceleration, the availability of technology, the impact of AI and robotics, etc. We also would have spent lots of time thinking about the impact of demographics. If anybody has to read one more article about millennials, I'm sure it would, frankly, they don't need to. And we did have a little chat earlier about whether we were going to mention the election going on south of the border. And so it's my turn to perhaps get that in first and mention, obviously, that we've seen continued political uncertainty and nothing more exaggerated than what we're seeing at the moment. So that was a big shift. We were already experiencing those sorts of things. The second area that we then identified, if you layer onto that, is then the impact of the pandemic. So a global pandemic caused the opportunity for what Josh Bersin refers to as a big reset, an opportunity to really pause and reflect on what was going on. What we'd seen is continued growth in the market. Businesses were working really hard to continue to perform. And many argued that the bubble was perhaps ready to burst. And let's face it, it did burst, and it burst big time. As Val mentioned, we feel that the pandemic has caused an acceleration of some of the future of work trends by anything between 5 and 10 years. There's been a big emphasis around remote work, and that's been a big story for many organizations. But I think it's fair to say, and I know we'll get into this when we have the conversation with Linda, who sat in her office with, she was just sharing with us 800 colleagues, the impact around the pandemic, I think, is much bigger than remote work. And we have to be careful that we just don't take that as being the big story here. So we had the pandemic, CHROs were busy kind of reacting to that. And then, as Val mentioned, you layer onto that a whole series of social inequalities that we've experienced following the tragic murder of George Floyd on May 25th in Minneapolis. People demanded action, and many HR teams, I think it's fair to say, were left wanting. They were reacting to the pandemic and had to shift focus quickly to think about how they were going to ensure their organizations and their cultures were ready to deal with these different things that were going on and make sure that they had the right actions in place. So what we really see is this trifecta of activity, as I like to call it. And then if we apply that through the organizational dimensions that we touched on, what we see then is an emerging paradigm. We think what we see is an organization that becomes much more purpose-driven, much more focused on delivering value to all its stakeholders, not just its shareholders, with particular emphasis around customers and employees. So it's really the shift from shareholder value to stakeholder value. And so we think that's a big emphasis for the emerging paradigm.
And Mark, as you move forward, I know we talked a bit about this last week, but what do you imagine as sort of the road from A to B, or the bridge from the old to the new? I would I would imagine there are a bunch of people in our audience thinking they relate completely with this emerging paradigm. That's where they're pushing. And I would imagine there are some folks in our audience who are thinking about institutional investors who are still going to reward, quarterly driven, profit driven organizations. How do you imagine the bridge from one to the other?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it's really a case of thinking very deliberately about where you're starting. And every organization is going to be very different. The model that Val and I produce really allows you to think about organization on a case-by-case basis and identify where there are strengths and where they really need to make progress. But I think you're right, kind of convincing the kind of top of the house around these changes is really the key thing. That's where you're going to drive a lot of value. And whilst we've seen some emphasis around people thinking more about the importance of being much more purpose-driven, everyone will be familiar with the Business Roundtable changing their perspective on it last year. Larry Fink's annual letter to the investor population is increasingly talking about the importance of organizations thinking more about the environment. I think there's still a long way to go to really sell this to organizations who I find often take much more of a short-term approach. So I think where we're going to move to is to Val, just to share the paradigm shifts in a bit more detail. So Val, back to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Mark. So these are the shifting dimensions. And along each of those 5 organization dimensions that Mark just introduced us to, on the left-hand side, you'll see a traditional paradigm. And on the right, it's an emerging paradigm. So it's a from-to model. And as Mark already kind of flagged to us, we've been very purposeful in terms of it being a very sharp distinction. So by no means would every organization on every dimension be kind of sitting squarely in that traditional paradigm space. Certainly this is a spectrum and many organizations are quite a ways along it. But for the sake of kind of being contrasting and a little bit provocative, we are setting it up this way. So if we look at values, and I should mention that for each of the 5 dimensions, there's a drill down slide that goes into a little more detail. So I'm going to, for the sake of time, do the drill down slide on just the first 2, on values and culture, because I think that's where we're going to kind of spend most of our emphasis today. And then I'll come back to the last 3 dimensions on this slide. So for values, where we see the shift really is that whereas it used to be the case that we would step into an organization and be asked to embrace the organization's values, the values that were quite germane to that organization, the emerging paradigm is that organizations must adjust to and look for ways to embrace new societal values that really are very much across the board. Obviously, the most the most recognizable being that health and safety is important everywhere, and so those protocols, those all of the elements that go into keeping employees, customers, stakeholders healthy and safe is priority 1. But there are a couple of others here. So we see a real shift in the D&I space, as the diversity and inclusion space, as Mark identified. We see it as a distinction from that's about belonging. And so it's really as in, who really belongs, whose voice counts, who has the power in the organization. And for us, that's a shift away from that belonging being very centered on 2 privileged groups, men and white people, and everyone else kind of being others relative to those 2 groups, to a new paradigm where belonging and voice and power is available to everyone. And it's achieved through very structured, conscious, systemic design. So certainly it's not a flip of a switch. And we know that there's a lot of work that needs to happen in very different ways than I think D&I was approached in the past. A couple of other shifts in this dimension is around mental well-being becoming very mainstream, and the supports around those becoming very mainstream in organizations. The notion of kind of a shift from corporate social responsibility to organization selflessness. It's really about companies just stepping up to the block to contribute to the community in whatever way is required because it's the right thing to do. And that is a very Canadian stance, and we think is something that very much differentiates Canadian corporate culture, Canadian companies, from potentially from others around the world. There's also a real blurring of lines between family and kind of personal and home, personal and family. There is a very, very kind of lowest common denominator. We are all kind of, as one colleague calls it, playing Hollywood squares, and we're looking into the living room of the CEO, and his or her, toddlers are around their ankles as much as anyone else's. So there's a real blurred boundary there in terms of personal and work. The next drill down slide we're going to look at is the culture one. And this one is, in this dimension, the shift is that whether we were conscious of it or not, a lot of our organizations were very much designed around this notion that people couldn't really be trusted. So if you look at kind of all the rules and the policies and the incentive programs and the oversight and the supervision, it was really all about managing to the lowest common denominator. And the notion that if you look away, people are really going to be slacking off. So you've really got to kind of keep them on the straight and narrow. The collective kind of aha came with this big social experiment when people went home. The places didn't fall apart. In fact, many organizations reported productivity gains. Many CHROs that we've talked to have talked about their engagement scores kind of going through the roof. Certainly people showed up and they did the right thing. So in the right ecosystem, and what we mean by that is, with the right leadership, with the right tools, with the right environment, the right decision-making protocols, people really will show up and do the right thing. And so then that really kind of provides something for us in terms of if we let go of some of that very tightly controlled hierarchy and distribute and push those decisions out into the places and spaces that are close to the customer, close to the market, things really can happen in a more empowered way. We talked about virtual work. Obviously that is a very, very big shift from kind of coming to the office to do work every day to what we see as a future where it will be a hybrid. There certainly are outlier organizations that are kind of going on the record now saying we are completely virtual. There are some organizations that want to kind of call everybody back to the office because everyone is there in the plant. And so we all have to get back to the office. But we also, are seeing that the pendulum is swinging toward more of a hybrid approach. We've got proof of concept that we don't need to, kind of sit in an office in cubicles to work independently. And so what will offices provide for us in terms of collaboration and meeting and creative spaces? Mark mentioned the one of the big HR thinkers, Josh Bersin. He talks about the unbossed organization. And again, this is the notion that if we're not looking over people's shoulders, if we're kind of checking in and not checking up on people, what will we then be unleashing in terms of allowing people to get their best work done and be measuring them? So think performance management on an outcomes basis as opposed to kind of an input basis. The other idea that I love on this slide, and Mark Edgar was the one who kind of taught me this, is we've moved away from the golden rule to the platinum rule, which is really treating people the way that they would like to be treated. We have very much reset the behavior code in organizations, and empathy, respect, equity, compassion, kindness are the rules of engagement right across the board. So as I promised, I'm going to go very quickly through the last three dimensions so that we can get into our conversation. Leadership, it's really about leaders being in that hierarchy and kind of control, rules-based, to much more human-centered, character-based, conscious, mindful leaders who help people kind of align their work with the purpose of the organization. When it comes to organization capabilities, in the past, we've had a very fixed view of what we need to be good at in this sector or in this industry or this company to compete and thrive. That has very much shifted toward first of all, just a level set of we all need to be good at certain things. We all need medical knowledge. We all need analytics. We all better know something about digital. We all need to know crisis management. We all need to have leadership capabilities and D&I capabilities. But the way that organizations now are kind of much more fluid and much more agile in their building of new capabilities in the organization, including automation and AI. Really is very, very, very fluid and very kind of growth oriented. And then finally, as Mark mentioned, that last dimension is really a catch-all. Everything from organization design to jobs to how we do succession planning, to how we do performance management. And the real shift in talent strategies is away from these very fixed, static, kind of predictable cycles and into, again, a much more agile, fluid, dynamic, flexible environment. Think, matrixed organizations, think talent platforms, think working through performance management cycles that might not be tied necessarily to calendars, but more projects and more feedback oriented and team oriented. So let me stop there and take a breath and actually move away from the slide deck, Mark Healy, and back over to you.
Yeah, just one. I want to get to Linda, but just one question on all this. It strikes me as we go through it. Some of this is. It feels a bit like organizations sort of waking up to, our employees are people too. Is that some of this at a rudimentary level?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting way of looking at it. I think that we always said the right things, that people are centered, that we're very people-centered organizations, and people are our business. And yet, when the pandemic hit, it really became very apparent that organizations were going to just fall apart without their people in there. So yes, I do think that when Mark Edgar talked about that purpose-driven organization and multiple stakeholders, I think the employee stakeholder has definitely kind of come up the food chain in organizations, and there will be a lot more bespoke and focused, and there is already a lot more focus on the employee experience and enabling and equipping the employee to be productive in whatever context the organization needs them to be.
Okay, thanks. And thanks to you and Mark for bringing that frame forward. Really good background for at least part of where we will go next. Linda, I want to spend a few minutes with you. And I know you've probably got some reactions to the frame, but let's not start there. Let's start with kind of current stats. You've been impacted like everyone else, but you've got a sort of a different base you're starting from. I think you said in the prep about 2/3 of your employee base, which is 15,000 or more. They're skill based, and so they have the opportunity for remote work. So can you just talk a bit about generally what's happened at JDI as COVID has set in?
Sure, and appreciate the opportunity, everyone, and thanks, Mark. So as Mark said, a significant, probably 2/3 of our employee base are sort of more on the hourly side of work, skill based. They're in mills, they're on the floor of stores, they are driving trucks, and they are driving trains, and so COVID for us, while we had the same experiences as others, we were able to, prove that our people who could work from home had jobs that they could do remotely. They were able to immediately get up and work from home, and business, as Val said, business functioned, bills got paid, work continued to move forward. So, like many organizations, we learned a lot about our ability to move very quickly, but also be able to survive in a virtual world for those people who actually had jobs that can be done remotely. For 2/3 of our workforce, though, you can't work from the sawmill from home, and so there were a lot of our people who needed, for our businesses, and we're in sort of industries that we would have been deemed essential services. We needed to continue, and so our values around health and safety have never become more critical than they were through COVID. And so, I think what we experienced and what we heard from our people was real positive feedback on how they felt we put their health and safety sort of first and foremost, and whether that was our own people and their families through finding supports like telemedicine, and making sure they had all the right PPE to be able to continue to do their job, to supporting our communities, sharing what we were learning about how we were operationalizing our plans, helping not-for-profit organizations understand what they could do, sourcing, and in our case, because we're so diversified, making our own PPE, making masks, making disinfectant. So in sharing that with our community. So the health and safety has always been a value for us, and it certainly became critical and was probably the most important positive feedback we got from our employees in terms of how we dealt with COVID, what that meant for them and their families and our communities. And when we did our engagement survey this fall, we saw it in spades come out in the engagement survey, positive feedback around health and safety, but also positive impact on engagement. So flexibility did play out here, but to your point, flexibility played out, and we probably, when Val was showing the slides around the traditional organization and what the paradigm looks like, our organization is definitely more on the traditional side. And so what COVID did for us around flexibility and work from home probably would have taken us 10 years to accomplish in terms of where we were. We learned a lot, and I think it's advancing a conversation for those jobs that can be done virtually, that we may not have had or would have taken us a long time to have. But through that, we also learned that while we have jobs that we can work from home, we like being together in the office. We get great energy from being together in the office. The collaboration is better. And so, when we were able to get our people back to the office, they were delighted to run into the building, making sure we had the right safety protocols in place to keep them safe while they were in the building. But we learned while we can work at home, we definitely had a preference to being together in the office.
I want to do a little bit on kind of values and culture, and then a bit on your role, Linda. So on values and culture, and whether COVID was the sort of direct contributor or just the impetus, have there been bits and pieces of values and culture that have really shifted? Maybe for the right reasons, and others that have stayed the same, or is everything kind of a constant, just reinterpreted?
No, I would say what's happened. So we are having conversations about flexibility. And whether that is flexibility around, where we work, what we wear to work, how we work. So we're engaged in those discussions will obviously impact what I would describe as our very traditional culture that has been successful here for a long time. I would say the other thing is we are also having conversations, Mark, around inclusion and diversity, and that is less about COVID and more about everything that's been happening in our society, and what it has allowed us to have some discussions with our executives that maybe we weren't having prior to those events happening in society. So it's opened up. I think the combination of COVID and what we've learned, plus what's going on in society, is going to help us evolve our culture. But in a typical JDI way, it'll be an evolution and not a revolution, because there are so many parts of our culture that we feel are the secret sauce to why we've been successful over so long a period, and we don't want to move so far from it that we lose what that secret sauce was.
Let's talk a little bit about your role, especially right now. I really thought of you, yesterday and the last 2 days with this other organization I spent some time with. They onboarded a new CHRO, during sort of COVID, and she talked a fair amount about the challenge that presented, but also an opportunity, and how she thought it was affecting her role and her team, her HR team.
Right.
You're not a lifer with JDI. You're still relatively new as well, and so just talk a bit about your role itself and your team and how you're coping with all that.
Sure. So I joined at a very interesting time. So it was March 31st was my first day at JDI. Many of the workers here at head office had been sent home to work virtually. So when I came into the office the first day, there was no one else on my floor. But what I did have so for me, what was unique about joining during COVID, while I didn't get to, it was more difficult to obviously know my team. It was very difficult to get out to our businesses and really understand the business because I wasn't able to go and visit sites. I did have the advantage of, because we were in COVID and the executives were, and owner was aggressively and actively managing it, we were meeting every single day. And so for me as a new CHRO, I was with the executive team every single day for probably 3 weeks. The day started with an executive meeting. Where are we? What do we need to be doing? I saw our values up close and personal in a way that I probably wouldn't have in non-COVID like times because of the crisis that we were managing and everybody else was managing. And so it was a unique onboarding for that reason. The advantage was I got to spend so much time with my peers and our owner. I got to see our culture and our values up close and personal. And the downside was some of the more the other more normal onboarding things you would have done with your team, being able to understand the business became a little bit more difficult through the COVID times. But now we're all like, we are fortunate. We're here in our Atlantic bubble. We are able to, there are 700 or so of us in head office here. We're able to work together. And we've been in this place since probably late June. So it's obviously a little bit different here on the East Coast than it is across the rest of Canada. And we're certainly feel very fortunate and keep our fingers crossed and knock on wood that continues.
One more question for you, and then we'll do a bit of a panel discussion. If you think about Val and Mark's frame or some other frame, is your team having conversations with employees or asking questions of employees or engaging in metrics that are maybe different than they would have been a year or 2 or 3 ago?
I think we are. What's interesting is I would say, I don't know that it is our team engaging with our people. I'm finding our people are engaging with us and asking. So we are being asked things like, okay, so we learned some things about virtual work. So what is that going to look like? How much of that is going to stick post-COVID or post, for us, the summertime, because now that we're all back in the office. So what's interesting, it's less about us going and talking to them about it. And I'm finding that our employees are coming to us to talk about how we will continue to take what we learned from COVID and take those things that will stick and stay with us, this year and into the future.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's bring up the full panel together and maybe a bridge as we start this discussion is, and Mark, you've actually been able the last few minutes to engage with a couple of the audience members and comments that have come in through the chat. Do you want to just kind of recap that and anything you want to add to what you've been commenting here?
Yeah, kind of my natural curiosity gets the better of me. So some couple of great comments came in through to the chat. So one person was thinking very much about the fact that purpose-driven organizations can't be relaxed here during this time and have to also think about how they reimagine work, which I think is really important. I think the consideration I give to that is really goes back to this idea of being very, very thoughtful about what your starting point is. I think, from my experience, the organizations I've spoken to, those that are very well established when it comes to their culture and definition around their values, seem to, and I say seem to, I haven't got any kind of direct measurement of this, but seem to have been much better at adapting to these changes and making decisions quickly around the safety of their employees and the different actions they have to take. And I think, Linda, what you just shared with relation to JDI is a great example of that. You knew that safety is a kind of really key value, and you were able to respond to that in a very thoughtful way. So yes, I think purpose-driven organizations, I suggested in my response, were perhaps a bit further ahead, but couldn't be relaxed in relation to the work they were doing. Should I touch on the second one, Mark?
Sure.
came through. Yeah. So the second one was also a great question, something that comes up a lot. So as you think about culture and learning, people find it easier to do things when they're in the office together. Linda just mentioned that her colleagues like connecting and being in touch. So just what advice are there for organizations who are moving to more of a distributed workforce when they are concerned about losing their culture? And so my thought there is really that you have to be super deliberate in understanding what are the kind of moments that matter when it comes to your current culture, and how can you reinforce those in a kind of digital environment. So it's really this idea of shifting to analog to digital and being very deliberate and thinking about the actions that you're going to take. And those things are possible. Again, what I see with a number of organizations is that they're leaving that a bit to chance. And I think they have to be a lot more thoughtful in creating those things and actually working with their team to come up with ideas. So yeah, a couple of great comments that came through, and hopefully those responses are helpful.
And of course you added they should phone the Ivey Academy for the learning part.
Of course, Mark.
There are a couple of really good questions that come in through the Q&A. I'd like to get to them right away. I'll combine two of them here. So one is about, are we being you, changing your hiring plans or your onboarding and transition plans to try and attract folks that are going to be flexible and adaptable and up with the pace of change. So it's not really a COVID question; it's a sort of pace and contemporary future work question. Are maybe Linda, we'll start with you. Are you changing who you go after on the attraction side, or how you onboard?
I don't. So we are changing how we onboard because of some of the restrictions that are on us at this time. So using technology a lot more. We're doing that like everyone else is. I think you can't. I guess I can only speak for us. You've got to make sure that whatever you are going out and sort of promising in the talent market, you're able to deliver in terms of the employee experience. And so while I see in our case us being more open to conversations around flexibility, we are still more of a traditional organization. So you have to make sure that promise actually will meet up with the experience. We've always been looking for people who are adaptable, flexible, can move have good learning agility. So that's always been those are always attributes that we are looking for and capabilities we're looking for. So I don't see that as having changed as a result of sort of recent events.
And what about Val, Mark, with your client base, are you seeing organizations kind of line up against the right side of your slides and starting to hire against that, or are we a cycle too early in that evolution?
Yeah, I'll start, and then maybe Mark, you can jump in. So it's a little of both. So it depends on, and there's a question in the chat about kind of which industries are in action, because there are a lot of industries that are in big action in terms of hiring. So anyone who's involved in digital or food retail and digital supply chains, etc. So certainly, what I speak with a lot of search firms, and so they are absolutely telling me that the profile of executive, the profile of leader, is changing, and so they are, wanting to, we kind of have a different. There's a different capability currency now, and it is about certainly about technical literacy, but it's also about curiosity and agility, resilience. A lot of those buzzwords are buzzing because they are real, and so at the same time, we're still, and as Linda has said rightfully, different parts of the country are having different experiences. But certainly in the big center where I live, we are still in this pandemic, and so CEOs and boards are kind of looking around the executive tables, and even if they may feel that some of the players are wanting, or maybe they don't have the strategic heft, or maybe they don't have the what they need going forward, it's difficult to contemplate kind of making a lot of change when you're in the middle of this crisis, and in the kind of changing horses in the middle of a race. So I do think And certainly lots and lots of people I speak with say that there will be a wave of upskilling and strategic skilling, both outside in terms of buying capability and bringing it in, but also inside, because we will not buy all the capability that we need. And so that goes back to the question of how to work, how do organizations embrace the building of the internal kind of acquisition of in very agile kind of real-time ways of the emerging capability requirements. It's, kind of, if you talk about that as a build buy strategy, you're definitely not going to go to the market and get a future ready leader every time. So there will be a lot of double down on investment in talent within organizations and within sectors.
And Mark, if I just add to what Val said, I would say, 6 months ago, COVID and the pandemic was all we were dealing with. Every day was, what do we need to do to, today to continue to keep our people safe and keep our business moving. We've now got to a place where we are, while we are still in the pandemic, we need to figure out, it is not going anywhere for quite some time. And so now it is about, how do we still advance our organization, advance our talent strategy, in a pandemic. And so we got to look at we are now looking at getting back to the things that we had planned to do and still need to do, and figuring out how do we do that in pandemic. So we had a lot of things on pause, and now we've gone back and sort of picked them up and said, okay, maybe it's going to look a little different than it did before. But we still have to invest in our people, develop their skills, grow their leadership, make sure we are doing the right things from a people management perspective or a succession perspective. And so it may look a little different than we had planned, but we're still needing to kind of go back to that and drive our strategy forward and do it in the pandemic.
We've got a few more questions we want to get to. One of them was how do we build or rebuild a healthy culture in this time? And if I read in a little bit to the comments from all three, it strikes me one of the keys to all this is to say, well, it's not a crisis anymore. Not calling it a crisis and get on with it. Is that too provocative, or is that fair?
I think it's is it too provocative? I don't think it's particularly too provocative. I think it's the opportunity that the pandemic has provided organizations to be really tested has to be reviewed. There are so many lessons to learn through that process. I think it's our nature is to keep moving forward. I think the resilience that we've shown as a human race during this time is phenomenal, and we should be very encouraged by that. But it's also our tendency to not reflect as much as we should on what's happened. And I think we do forget things quite quickly. So for me, I think there is an opportunity just to be, again, use that word deliberate, really deliberate and thoughtful about taking the time to reflect on how did you turn up as an organization? Did your values hold up at that time? Were your leaders equipped to deal with it, to deal with this situation? Because there'll be something else. If it's not a pandemic, it'll be another pandemic, or it'll be just a continued level of disruption, which we're having to deal with. And I think, as I say, many organizations, many leaders were left wanting during that time. And I think you have to acknowledge that and think about what you do differently next time.
Do we think a post-COVID world is coming, or is this the world?
I hear a lot of language out there, and about kind of what's the new normal and what's the landing place, and are we there yet? And I love the analogy of kind of trying to nail the jelly to the wall, and it's not sticking yet, right? Because we're still kind of in this space of change. I think as human beings and as collections of human beings, as organizations, we look for equilibrium. We look for what we can kind of control and settle. And so I think one of the phenomenon we have here is that where there is so much that is unsettled, where we can touch and feel like it's a real touchstone is on things like values and purpose, and culture falls out of that. And so, yes, we are interrupting kind of ways of working. I don't think we're done yet. I don't think we're there yet. I think it is a journey, not a destination. and every organization kind of gets to declare their own milestones along the way. But my own view is that that's why we are hearing so much about purpose and values and those greater ideas, because that's the stuff that will not get interrupted. That's the bedrock in many ways. And those are the signals and the touchstones that everyone in your organization needs to kind of ladder up to when so much of the pragmatics and the processes and the practicalities are in flux.
Yeah, I think maybe on a personal level, I think I buy that. I think that makes a lot of sense. What I find strange from some organizations is with what I would look at as quite a limited data set. When we've not been through this before, I don't think we think we're through the other end of it, whatever that looks like. We're making, in some cases, relatively large bets or big decisions on a limited data set. That in terms of tactical decisions, we will never do this again. We will always do this again. I find that quite strange. In no other part of business would you do that with less than a year's worth of data. The focusing on purpose and touchstones to just have something in place to act as a guiding light to make other decisions makes a ton of sense to me. And I think in this conversation, all three of you are advocating around that, but none of you, I don't think, are advocating for let's make hard and fast calls, tactical calls right now. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, certainly from my perspective, I think you're right. I think you have to be very kind of ready to pilot and use this as an opportunity to test different things. I think some organizations have been very bold on the infamous kind of remote working thing. We've been through this huge experiment, and lots of tech companies and Shopify have made big calls around what they're going to do. I would suggest that's taking it too far, and I think things will come back. But I think we do want to change. It kind of strikes me that work was broken in so many ways that we do need to take the opportunities that come from this kind of awful situation with the pandemic and really see the positives there and the opportunities to do things differently. How many people loved commuting? How many people loved being in an organization where there was a huge amount of hierarchy and bosses that weren't treating people properly and working in unhealthy environments? I think there's so many things that we can change and should change, and we've got this great opportunity to do it. I'm a bit worried that as time goes on, we might miss that opportunity, which is why Val and I are so passionate about telling the story around these things and these things that can be done differently.
There's a great capstone question in the Q&A, so I'd like I'll read this word for word and then read a little bit in, and perhaps we could end with a number of comments on this. So the question comes from Steph. It says, it seems the shift from traditional to emerging will require a lot of uncomfortable change for some organizations and also a lot of time to shift. How do you try to change the paradigm when corporations are so focused, or at least some would be, on quick quarterly results, the traditional mindset, and build a new mindset after being a certain way for so long? And I guess what I would read into that a little bit, if it helps prompt some of the directions for the answers, you could imagine shareholder pressure would be one way to usher it along. You could imagine boards becoming more enlightened, contemporary, sophisticated, forward-looking, and boards forcing it on management teams. You could imagine employees demanding it from the ground up. You could imagine CEOs coming together across industries and saying, look, like we are the ones that are responsible, and we have to shepherd this along. So I'd actually like all of you to come in with comments. Maybe Val, could we start with you?
Sure. I think to use an overused word, I think what is unprecedented about this moment in time is that we have not had, arguably for a good 100 years, we have not had a collective societal shared experience as a reference point. So none of this is happening in a vacuum. The relationship between the individual and the organization has been made very, very osmotic, if you will, if that's a word. There's a lot of kind of holes in that. And then the relationship between the organization and society also has a lot of flow through. And so I don't think shareholders are going to react in a vacuum. I don't think that, I certainly, because I listened to a weekly conference call where there are chairs of HR committees and chairs of boards and people who sit on multiple big boards across the country and across the globe. The conversations that they are having are these conversations. They're having conversations about culture, talent, engagement, safety, health, mental health in organizations, leadership, and how that has changed. So there is a wave, I guess. And again, if you kind of come back to the point of view that Mark and I share, we believe that this wave is here, that organizations are going to kind of, be on the very front end of it, or maybe they're going to be fast followers, or maybe they're going to dig their heels in and want to stay the way that they were. But society and work in the context of society has changed under our feet. And so how does an organization embrace this kind of culture change? One conversation at a time, one work practice at a time, one iterative experiment at a time. We've built so much muscle in, kind of putting things out there that aren't perfect, learning from our mistakes, trying something new. That in and of itself is a behavior that we can all kind of get behind, because that's what our lives look like today. So I think the wave is well underway, and the organizations that are consciously riding it are going to be the ones that win.
Linda, maybe you next.
Yeah, no, I'm with Val. It is all of those things that are part of that shift from sort of traditional to emerging. Any one of them are any one of those shifts would take in a tremendous amount of time and effort on its own. And so, I think you've got to do an analysis of your organization and your strategy and figure out what is the shift, or what is the part of the shift that makes the most sense for you, and start that one conversation at a time, one initiative at a time, trial and error. Because you're never, as my father would say, you're never going to get to second base if you don't take your foot off first. And so you've got to try something, because to expect that you're going to make that shift without some of those little the pieces of work over time that are going to get you there, it's not going to happen. And you can't be so daunted by the size of the shift, because you're right, on every dimension it's large, but if you figure out the dimension or the part of the dimension that makes the most sense for your organization, where you can get, where you can find a business case, you can find voice, then you start picking away at that one.
Mark, to you, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question from Steph, and something that I kind of wrestle with as well, and agree with everything that Val and Linda said. As a CHRO, I was very much forced into that quarterly cycle, and it was something I remember struggling with as well. I think maybe offer two just slightly different perspectives. I don't understand enough about markets and shareholders and how they impact organizations to comment on that part of it. So I would look for two opportunities, I think, here. One is kind of very much bottom up. So I'm a huge fan of kind of voice of the people kind of stuff. So I think the more insights you can get and kind of hold the mirror up to senior leaders to make them understand the impact of what they're doing, I think that's helpful. And I think also you have to start with self. I think it's through these changes and the opportunities people have had to kind of spend time reflecting in different environments and be much more transparent and vulnerable during this time as individual leaders. I think there's a huge opportunity to kind of reflect on self-purpose and see how that relates to organizational purpose. And hopefully there's more of a connection there. So there'd be a couple of thoughts I'd offer.
I guess I've got a bit of an old-fashioned view. I think that employees respond to managers, and managers respond to management, management responds to the board. And so I think if the board is asking for this on a quarterly basis, I think you're likely to have that cascade down. I would put my faith in boards more than anything. Sean, can we come to you? Just talk a bit about what happens from here, recordings, et cetera, please.
Sure. Thanks. And great discussion today. If you're interested in learning more about the work we do at the Academy, you can visit us online at iveyacademy.com. We also post regular resources for leaders and organizations on our blog, and you can follow us on your favorite social platform to keep up with the latest content. In terms of this session, we'll be sending out an emailed link to the full recording that you can share with your colleagues, and we'll include the slides and some more information about that framework along with that. Thanks.
Val and Mark and Linda, very generous with your time and all the preparation for today. And great job today. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. You always say yes to us. So thank you. And to our audience who tune in as always, thanks very much. And we'll see you next time. Cheers.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Cheers.